Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Not Yet Adults podcast. I, of course, am one of your hosts, Collin Geffrey, joined by the one and only Eric Zayas.
Hey, Colin.
Every time. Now, I'm going to take a page out of Eric's book here and remind everyone that's listening, this, of course, is the Not Yet Adults podcast, the podcast where twice a week Eric and I get together, talk about life, talk about Earth, talk about this impending thing on the horizon for us both called adulthood and sort of how we're adapting and changing and growing and getting into that whole, being adulthood thing. So anyways, Eric, how's your day going, buddy?
Pretty good. I did some stuff that you claimed were particularly adult-esque before we started the podcast. I went to work, worked 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Not 7 p.m. to 4 a.m. That wouldn't make sense. I'm not a closer. Then after work, I went and got groceries. And then when I got home, I exercised, which is something pretty new, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, we talked about exercise before, but the increase of exercise is pretty new. And I, after exercising, cooked that food I bought from the grocery store, made myself dinner.
All I'm saying, man, is if this keeps up, we're going to have to change it from Not Yet Adults to Eric is an Adult, because that's pretty darn close, man. That's all I'm saying.
It's going to be called Eric is an Adult and Colin isn't, and let's talk about it.
I don't know how that works for search engine optimization of who's typing in Eric is an adult and Colin isn't : let's talk about it. That's pretty niche as far as titles go.
We'll workshop it. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, we a lot of episodes ago, I don't remember how many, we had the cooking topic, and we said hey, we're both gonna go cook one thing and then talk about it on the next episode, and we both totally forgot. And 3 episodes later,
we didn't.
Yeah, spoiler alert for behind the scenes or whatever. And then I think I was like, hey, did you ever do that? And you were like, no, I didn't. I was like, crap, me neither. So yeah, maybe we'll revisit cooking at some point. That's awesome though. That's really cool that you're exercising more and cooking and all that. That's pretty rad.
And I don't want to be rude, so I should ask too. How was your day, Colin? What'd you do today?
My day was fascinating, Eric. I woke up and now I'm here.
When did you wake up, at 8?
No, I wake up usually about 7. All my days right now are the same, which is I do the YouTube video for that day and social media and stuff for that day. Depending on the day, I might edit this podcast, and then I job search. That's my whole life right now.
What's your workflow with YouTube? Do you record certain days and then the other days you just edit, or does it change day to day?
I kind of become a creature of habit very quickly, and so sometimes it's tempting, especially if I really like a game, to record 2 or 3 videos in one sitting. But when I do it that way, then 2 or 3 days goes by without me recording, and it's kind of I'm not pretending to be great at it or anything, but it's kind of like a muscle. If you're not constantly using it and stretching it, then you're going to kind of atrophy and get worse at it. And so I like to record every single day. So my goal is to have the following day's video. So let's say it's Monday. I try and by noon have Tuesday's video recorded, edited, and the export started, so that by the time I get lunch, I check in with my folks, see how that's going, and then I go back down to my room, I review the video, make sure it's all good, and then I upload it for the next day. And then I work on the thumbnail and the Instagram post and all that stuff. So it's basically 24-hour turnaround on everything. Monday is all about Tuesday's content. Tuesday is all about Wednesday's content, kind of like that.
I'm kind of curious about a certain part in there you talked about checking in with your folks. And I want to ask something that I've been meaning to ask you for a bit. First of all, when you say checking your folks, what does that entail?
So part of I don't know if agreement sounds very rigid, and I don't mean to paint it that way, but basically when I got home from school, I had a conversation with my folks. It's kind of the talk of this is where I'm planning on going, and this is where I'd like to be in a few months. And basically my staying here right now, rent-free and bills-free, which is very, very considerate of them, is contingent on me continuing to apply for jobs that I'd really, really like to work at. Not just a summer job or something, but something I would like to turn into a career. And so, providing that I am job searching every day for those jobs and that I check in with them now and again to see if, there's housework that needs to be done or someone needs help with homework or something, whatever it may be. Basically just helping around with the family. Then I'm kind of staying here rent free and expense free. So that's usually just my time around noon. I try and have the video done by noon and then I go in, eat lunch, and then check in with my mom. And it's like, hey, what can I do around the house? Do the kids need help or whatever?
That's a pretty cool situation you got there. Another thing I was curious about, how is your relationship with your parents?
I mean, it's a big question. I will say I think my relationship with my parents right now is better than it's ever been.
That's great.
Yeah, I think so. I think part of that's just getting older and being a little bit more reasonable. And, often as a kid or especially as a teenager, you kind of have this feeling of, I mean, it's angst, right? It's no one understands me and I'm the exception to every rule and my parents are, putting me in this box. And very rarely, if ever, is that actually true. It's just how you feel when you're, kind of going through that time. But no, I would say my relationship now is better than it's ever been.
I feel like that's almost a rite of passage.
Oh yeah, yeah. You have to go through that angsty Anakin Skywalker. No one gets me. Like period. Just I'm so angry. But what about you? I mean, how's your relationship with your folks?
Yeah, my relationship with my folks blossomed. That sounds so cheesy. Over the, I mean, like it's just like how we are now, based on how we were. I never had a really turbulent childhood with my parents, like some other people might experience. I feel like my relationship with my parents has definitely evolved since I was a child, in that I see them more as like equals. It's something that I've heard other people talk about that seems so strange when you're growing up and you see how you talk to your parents as an adult versus how you talk to them as a child, and you realize like, oh, we're kind of on the same level now. I mean, you're still definitely a parent, but now that I'm old enough to like kind of, for the most part, not in all ways, but for the most part, fend for myself, we're kind of walking side by side rather than me following you.
Yeah, it's when this is probably, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, but I had a friend that I want to say she was a couple years older than me. I don't know. But basically, we were talking about parents and our relationships with them and how that works. And she had kind of said that around the time she turned 16, her parents weren't really like her keepers or her guardians anymore. It was more like they were her advisors. And it was like, you're living here and we want you to go live your life and be happy, and we're not really going to judge you as much. Just come to us when you need us, and we're going to give you support in whatever way we can. And that was always very fascinating to me because I feel like, especially as a kid and a teenager, your parents are kind of like almost like your wardens in a weird way. And I understand that sounds so strange, but really they're there to tell you no to stuff in a lot of ways.
As you grow up, you appreciate that. You like understand like the reason behind those no's, because there's probably a no in response to like a request that was ridiculous or going to get you hurt or something. But definitely as a kid, it feels like, oh, this person exists only to hold me back.
Yeah, and that's really hard when you don't have the maturity or the insight to kind of look at that and say, okay, they are doing this in my best interest, even if it doesn't feel like it now. And it's easy to look back on it and be like, oh yeah, they were just looking out for me. But when you are going through those times, especially as a teenager where it feels like just the whole world's out to get you and no one really understands, it's really hard to kind of sit with all that because you've lived with these people your whole life, and then suddenly it feels like, oh, they're out to get me. They don't understand me. It's very edgelord and kind of cringy. But, I do feel like we all go through that. Like you said, it's a little bit of a rite of passage.
Exactly. I'm kind of curious, and like, feel free to like only talk about what you're comfortable talking about. I was curious how your relationship with your parents when you were younger was, and kind of how that dynamic was, and how that's changed. Like I want to get a sense of like the contrast of like Colin's parents as a kid versus Colin's parents like during the teenage years, or kind of during the like current day Colin.
Well, let me tell you first, Eric, it's great to be here and on this show. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking my call. No, and so like we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here because this is something I haven't talked about a whole lot. But when I was just born, just but a young warthog, my biological father left. He was not a great guy. He was kind of just had some issues. And so my mom didn't meet my dad until I think I was about 3, and he's not my biological dad, but he's been my dad for as long as I can remember, so that's what I call him. And that wasn't really an issue. Eventually, my biological father came back into the picture, and I'd kind of visit him once every other week until we decided to move away from California into Spokane. And that's when, for one reason or another, my bio dad just kind of went crazy and made this whole issue for us leaving, and there's this legal battle. It was very messy. It's this whole thing. But that's kind of when I start really thinking about my relationship with my parents, because I was having to now go visit my biological father and his wife more often. And it kind of felt like hitting pause on your real life, or like hitting pause on a really good video game to go do this crappy side mission for a while. And it was like, I don't enjoy this. I don't want to be here. This isn't where my life is. I just have to go put time in there. You know what I mean?
In a way, it's kind of like a job. It's like, oh, I just gotta go here, clock in, be here for however long I have to be here, then clock out, and I can go back to the other stuff I prefer doing, perhaps. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
No, honestly, that's very much how it was. And on top of that, when it's kind of under duress and there were legal circumstances around the whole thing, and I was just a kid, I felt, and in my opinion, rightly so, that I had to be very, very careful how I acted when I was over at his house and what I said when I was over at his house. And on the flip side of that, my parents couldn't be seen as coaching me or trying to turn me against him or anything like that, because that would look bad again in any sort of legal proceedings if it looked like they were trying to make me hate him or anything like that. And so from a very young age, my parents kind of had to be like, we're supporting you, but we can't really tell you what's right here. You kind of just have to figure it out for yourself.
wow.
And not in a bad way. Again, I don't resent them for this at all, but it was very much like, the more we tell you what to do here, the worse it's going to be for all of us.
Was there a fear? I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just curious if there was a fear that he would like gain custody of you or something, if there was proof that they were conspiring against him or something to that effect.
I mean, and I don't know all the legal aspects of the whole situation. I do know my mom had full custody. He basically just had custody to visit, and that was it. But because we were trying to move to Washington, and at this point I had 2 younger siblings, and of course my dad, who was married to her, he could make that difficult, because typically you can't really move away in that situation unless both biological parents are on the same page. And that's basically where it was at. And so for a while, like, our family was splintered. Like, my sister was staying with our grandparents in Idaho, and like my mom and I think dad and brother were up in Washington, and I was staying with my grandfather for a while. It was this whole thing. But it was basically just, he could make more trouble than it was worth to leave, kind of. And so yeah, that was in a lot of ways, I mean, it's kind of messed up to say, but that's where in my memory my relationship with my parents kind of starts, because that's when I realized that, like, you kind of have to figure this out for yourself in a lot of ways. Like, you can't always lean on these people, even though they are responsible for you. You can't lean on them for everything. Sooner or later, you are going to have to kind of call your own shots a little bit. And so, yeah, I mean, that was up until that whole thing happened till about the age of 12 or 13. And right around then, my bio dad basically just stopped, and there's another story there, but I haven't heard from him since then. And when that happened, it was kind of, and it wasn't like a, night and day, it immediately changed course thing. But when I stopped hearing from him, it was very much this sense of relief, because it's like, okay, I don't have to worry about this anymore. My life is here with my family, my mom and my dad and my brother and sister. And that's where my relationship with my parents kind of took more the course of what it is today. And then obviously right around then I hit teenage years, and that's where everyone has the most fun, because everything's all topsy-turvy. But no, it was, I mean, my relationship with my parents, especially in those early years, was knowing that they're there for you, but knowing that they can't be there for you in certain ways because of, it's just not how the situation allows, I guess.
Because of circumstantial, out of your control type stuff.
Yeah, and nobody's fault, but when there's just lawyers involved and the family's like in different states sometimes, and it was just this whole thing, and it was like you kind of had to look after yourself a lot of the time. And I don't mean to like paint myself as this like stoic warrior child of the streets that like fought for everything he had. I don't mean that at all. It was just you kind of had to figure stuff out for your own, because a lot of the time I wasn't with my folks, or I was in a place that I didn't feel comfortable and that sort of stuff. But anyways, what about you? Like kind of early childhood parent relationships. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, real quick, buddy. Gee whiz, I'm sending you hugs from through the airwaves because I mean I can't hug you in person, but it's
By the way, this is like long past stuff. Like this is all
yeah,
over and done with, and I hope I'm not making it sound like the tragic tapestry of my youth. Like I'm fine. It's all long in the past.
you
But
did it.
yeah.
You're stronger for it, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Well, my relationship with my parents when I was a kid, there's not a whole lot major, or there's not a whole lot of specific stuff I remember from my childhood, but I do have like a sense of what my parents were like, because I kind of always thought of them as the protectors, the guardians. They're these people who would like shield me from like some of the bad parts of the world, and in some ways there's a negative connotation with that, because like they protected me a little bit too much from stuff that I'm sure would have been bad for me, like hanging out with certain friends, or doing like certain activities that could end up like having a problem. But also like because of that, I didn't develop certain social skills, at least not until later in life. Not that I like that I can say that's entirely like there. I'm not like blaming. This isn't kind of like a therapy session where I'm like, well, it all started at 2 when my mom didn't hold me or something like that. I don't want to represent them like that, but they definitely had showed, I mean, obviously a healthy amount of concern for my well-being because of like the changing world. And now, like, oh god, I can't even imagine being a parent now with like the internet age, and how like so much messed up stuff is so much more easily readily accessible. Like I thought it was pretty bad when we were kids, but now it's like with everyone having a computer in their pocket at all times, a really highly advanced computer. It's a strange world.
And obviously every age is going to be different than the last, and we can only speak through the age that we've lived through. But I feel like 20, 30, 40 years ago, you could have that conversation as parents of how much do we want to shield them from and how much do we want to let them see. And in today's age, I don't really think there is any shielding it from them. I mean, the second they're on a laptop or a desktop or have their iPod or iPhone or whatever, it's like it is all there and it is everywhere. And their friends are talking about it and all these terrible things going on across the world. Like, I feel like, at least in that respect, children are expected and forced to grow up at a much younger age than they used to be.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
I don't know how you protect them from that. I think that just is a byproduct of our world.
I mean, it's kind of an impossibility to protect them in certain aspects, and it reminds me of this. A little aside, but I promise this is related to what we're talking about. My mom and I watched Black Mirror together, and the most recent season 4, had this episode called Valkyrie. I believe it was called Valkyrie. Basically, what the episode was about was a single mom whose daughter she's very protective of. She's so protective of her daughter that she buys this implant that she puts into the child that allows the mother to censor certain things, like if the kid sees something like a barking dog or something that the kid's scared of, violent, the image will be blurred and the audio from that thing will be like muffled. And so the kid kind of grows up with this like censor of all these terrible things. I remember watching the episode, and when the episode ended, I remember thinking, oh, that was kind of a lame episode. Like I didn't really like that, and I didn't really like get that. And my mom was like, that was my favorite episode of Black Mirror, because like, and she was saying to me, you, like, no offense, but you may not fully understand this because you're not a parent, but as a parent, that's like, a dream of ours, and like that's sort of, I mean, well, she didn't word it like that, but it definitely affected her way more than it affected me, because it played on the protective nature that parents have. And so I kind of acts as a really good example of like how protective my parents were, and like how much of a desire they had to keep me from certain things, and that really like made me the person I am today.
No, for sure. And I feel like when you're younger and a little bit more naive, and I don't even necessarily think this is entirely a bad thing, but there is this sort of hunger for knowing as much as you can know and seeing as much as you can see. And I just want all of it. Just give me everything in the world. I want to know about it all. And as a parent who is kind of more that grizzled survivor of the world, they've already seen some crap by the time they've had kids probably. and they're like, these things I wish I didn't know. I want to protect you from that.
Yeah, like trust me, you don't want to see everything because I've seen some stuff that you never want to know, and you don't know that like like kids like I sound like an old person saying this, but like younger generations, this is just like a natural thing. They don't realize that there's things that they don't want to know or things that they don't want to see or experience. But like since they don't know about those things and they're curious about the world, they'll seek out new experiences and they'll end up like stumbling across those things that they'll eventually regret.
And that's where you get rebellion, and that's where you get disobedience, and that's where you get, those angsty teen years. It comes from a place of love and care and them trying to protect you, and more often than not, what it inspires you to do is go seek those things out because you're attracted to what you don't know and what you don't have a frame of reference for.
It's a reverse psychology situation. Like they hold you away from something and it makes you want to reach for it that much more.
Right. And that's why, I think we're seeing a trend with a lot of parents and well, a lot of parents as, time goes on. And I kind of mix on how I feel about this, but parents that, let their kid have a drink with them from a young age, or talk to their kid about sex in a inviting atmosphere in a way that doesn't paint it as this dark thing that happens in a dungeon that you should always stay away from. Kind of having this open dialogue with your kid so that when those things come their way, there's not that sort of allure that a taboo thing has. They already know about it. They've already talked to their parents about it. They don't feel like they have to hide or run from these things because there's kind of that open dialogue there, as opposed to stay young a little bit longer. You don't need to know about this yet, because when you do that, I guarantee you they're already finding out.
Yeah, and when I become a parent, because that's like a goal of mine, I am really interested in that kind of parenting style. The sort of like, rather than like keep things from your kid, like try to just like, because they're gonna find them, be the person that like not necessarily shows them, but like tries to introduce it in a healthy way, like things like alcohol. You can have a drink here and then, and it's fine to drink alcohol. Just know that if you're gonna drink, you should do it in the house until you're old enough to do it outside, and drink in moderation. Everything is fine in moderation. And like even things like porn, like that's something kids are going to see, and it's an awkward topic for parents to talk about.
But have that dialogue.
Yeah, it's important to have that dialogue, and it's important for it to not be a taboo thing, because that could like seriously stunt their like sexual like psychology as an adult if you like make sex like taboo. And like, I mean, we're not experts, but like this is just...
Oh God, no. Everything we do on this podcast and say on this podcast should have a giant "We are not professionals" watermark on it for sure.
Absolutely. We're kind of getting, as you would say, long in the teeth. And I always like when you say that. I think that's a really cool analogy. As a sort of like kind of bookend to this sort of topic, I was kind of curious, how was your relationship in the later years, like as a teenager or even to current day, in comparison to how it was in early childhood? How has it evolved since then for you?
So for me, teenage years and current years, even though there isn't that much of a chronological gap between the two, very different circumstances around them both. When I first started, getting interested in video production and dating people and stuff like that, there was very much this rift between myself and my parents, because basically all the things that interested me and all the things that I wanted to put time into was away from them. And so for several years, I kind of like wasn't putting time into my relationship with my folks and like wasn't talking to them very much. And I guess just being how a lot of teenagers are, but it's like anything else. If you don't nurture it and take care of it, it being your relationship with your parents, then obviously it's not going to do very well. And so I'm going to say like 14 to 17, my relationship with my folks was kind of minimal. And then around 17 or 18, it was more like you were saying, where they were like, hey, we're not going to shame you for this stuff. We're not going to tell you can't do it. We're just going to talk with you about it openly, and we want to have this dialogue. And since then, where from my perspective, it's felt like they're treating me as, an adult or closer to an equal than they are a child, I feel like our relationship's been a lot better. I had like personal stuff at 18 and 19, and while I was away at PLU and stuff like that, that if you had told me or gone back and told my 14 and 15-year-old self that I had talked with my folks about that openly, I'd be like, no, you're out of your mind. You hid that in some dark crevice and never mentioned it to them because they'd crucify you. But the fact that we have that relationship now, if I can talk to them about stuff and tell them stuff, and I hate that I keep repeating myself, but have that dialogue of just openly talk about stuff and not feel like you have to hide things.
So important.
So important. And honestly, and I think we talked about this in episode 1, but I feel like I just see them more as people now, not as gatekeepers or as people that are there to discourage or inform you, but really just as people, and seeing their interests and their ideas and philosophies and their flaws too, because it's really hard to see your parents' flaws when you're growing up, because their flaws are they wouldn't let me go to that party, or they didn't get this thing for dinner or whatever, which aren't flaws. But when you see, oh, they're kind of socially awkward, or they don't like talking about this, or they're not good in these circumstances, you see them as people. And I feel like that's been really healthy, is kind of realizing, like, your parents are mortal. They put their pants on in the morning the same way you do, and I feel like you can empathize and relate to them a lot more when you're seeing them that way, and not as these kind of mythical figures that hold all the power to your life, I guess. So, but yeah, in a word, I think better. My relationship with my folks is a lot better than it used to be.
That's great. My experience, kind of similar to yours, but primarily in the sense of like the realization that your parents are people too, and like that's something you don't really see so much as a kid, because there's someone you look up to and they're like a bigger figure, like not necessarily like a god, but like like something that's like larger than you are.
Well, and I think I don't mean to cut you off, but when you spend all your time around anything, it's really hard to be objective about it. And when you've gone out into the world a little bit and seen other stuff, and then you come back and spend time with your folks, you have other experiences that aren't just in their orbit. You have other stuff that you've seen, and now suddenly you have this whole new lens that you're seeing them through, kind of.
For sure, it's a total paradigm shift when you have more experiences, and it's just interesting to like look at this person that's been like a figure in your life, a big statue of a person, and then as you get older, you talk like them and you act like them, and you realize like you get to a certain point where, I mean, they have their stuff together more than you are. Like our parents have their stuff together more than we do. So in that way, they're definitely more adults than us still, and that may always be the case. But you get to a point where you realize, when you get older, like, oh, these people are my equals to an extent. Like I talk to them on like an equal adult level, and we talk about much more mature subjects than we ever did before. And like I see these two people as like, instead of like the leaders of the family and like the leader of my life, so to speak, in a way, I see them more as like friends or equals. And that's something that as a teenager is really, or like as an adult, it's really nice to have that, because as a teenager, I felt that like my relationship with parents, I was kind of drifting apart for them and hanging out more with friends. And so to like, as an adult, I've reconnected with them, especially now that I moved back in with them, and a relationship is like definitely different than we were as kids, or like we're definitely different than like when I was a kid with them. But it's a totally evolved version of our relationship, and I think it's really nice to be able to talk to my parents as an adult.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good place to end it. I don't know. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for a really long time, actually, but in the context of the podcast, I feel like we kind of had a good arc there. I feel like we did it.
And now, if we talk any longer, we're going to overstay our welcome. So I think this is a good time for us to outro the podcast. Hit it, Collin.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been episode 16 of the Not Yet Adults podcast. Remember, the podcast comes to you every Monday and Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time on YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all other podcast services. We're also found on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Not Yet Adults, as well as on our own subreddit, r/Not Yet Adults, which you should check out and spend some time on if you can make it. If you could do us a personal favor, just take a few minutes out of your day. We would really appreciate it. Give us a rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. It helps the podcast get seen by more people, which we would really appreciate, because we put a lot of time into this, and the more people that we can sort of have a dialogue and welcome into this community, the better off that we are as content creators. So we would really appreciate it if you could do that. We will be back on Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time talking about something new, and we could not be more excited about that. So thanks for listening, and until next time, this has been Not Yet Adults.
And before we fully outro, I just want to say, in regards to the iTunes rating and review, if you need any additional incentive, we don't have any merchandise, so I can't give you a free shirt or whatever other like more legitimate podcasts do. But I promise that if you give a good rating and review, I will personally find you and give you a hug.
It's like Liam Neeson in Taken. I will find you and I will hug you.
It's a much nicer than what he proposed to do, that's for sure.
Yeah, he killed a whole lot of people in that movie, like a ton of people.
Well, great talking with you. Great talking with the audience, even though we don't, you know what I mean. Anyways, goodbye.